Okay, welcome. This lecture is the first lecture in our module that reviews biology. The biological perspective is one of the major approaches to understanding psychology. Really, in the biological perspective, we try to understand psychology by studying the physical basis for our behaviors. The simple assumption is that our thoughts, our feelings, our behaviors all have some sort of a biological origin. So this first lecture is about our brain and nervous system. The brain is the most complex part of our body, and it is the center of our conscious awareness. It controls all of our voluntary bodily functions like movement, and of course our involuntary bodily functions as well, like our breathing and our digestion. So the brain communicates to each part of the body through a nervous system, which is basically a network of channels that carry electrochemical signals. So we're going to get into all this. This is really an introductory overview of the brain, the various parts of the brain. We're going to go over some very basic neuroanatomy, do descriptions of parts of the brain, as well as functions of the brain, and then I will wrap up by talking about some of the methods that we study the brain. All right, so after watching this lecture, I hope that you'll be able to name the various parts of the nervous system and their respective functions, understand how neurons communicate with each other, name and identify brain structures and know their function. So, to be able to know a structure and know what it does, and then be able to name the various parts of the peripheral nervous system and know their respective functions as well. Okay, so this is just an overview. I'm going to start with the central nervous system, talk about the brain and neurons, as well as the limbic system. Then that's going to be most of the lecture will focus on the central nervous system. I'll then go to the peripheral nervous system and then end with studying the brain. So the nervous system is divided into two parts, a central and a peripheral nervous system, and the two heavily interact with one another. So the peripheral nervous system controls voluntary as well as non-voluntary behaviors using cranial as well as spinal nerves. It's the central nervous system that is primarily responsible for processing sensory information and then sending out electrochemical signals out to the peripheral nervous system for action. So we can think of the central nervous system as really receiving sensory inputs and then communicating with the peripheral nervous system to either make voluntary movements or any involuntary action as well. So let's talk about the central nervous system first. The central nervous system is the part of our nervous system that is encased in bone. So we have, of course, the brain that is encased in the skull, as well as the spinal cord encased in our spine. So, and as I said before, this is the portion of the nervous system that is most associated with processing sensory information. Okay, so we're receiving all of this, all these inputs from the world, and we need to make sense of those inputs and process it, and we do that, of course, in our brain. And then after we process that information, the central nervous system sends out electrical chemical signals to the peripheral nervous system for action. And it does this through individual nerve cells, which are called neurons. All right, so let's kind of zoom in, we could say, and take a close look at our nerve cells or our neurons. So a neuron has three main components. The first are dendrites. So you can see these look like antenna, and that's really what they are. So the dendrites are in charge of receiving signals. The next part is the soma, or the cell body. So you can see the kind of the center of the neuron here, as well as the center of the neuron here. So that's the cell body. And then there's this tail, or an axon, which leads away from one neuron and towards another. So you can think about neurons as talking to one another, and this occurs when an electrical charge builds up in one neuron, which is called an action potential. Okay, so we see that term, action potential. That action potential builds up in one neuron, and then it travels down the nerve axon toward, which is the tail, toward the synapse. So we've got the synapse circled here. The synapse is a small gap between neurons. So you'll notice as well that this axon is covered. Okay? It's covered in something called a myelin sheath. Here's that term right here, myelin sheath. The myelin sheath is a layer of fatty cells. This helps to speed up the action potential. Okay, so the myelin sheath, fatty cells, it speeds up the action potential. So that action potential has to cross this synaptic gap. Okay, it does that by releasing neurotransmitters, which I will explain in a little bit more detail in the next slide. But when those chemicals are released, so this is really the focusing on the chemical part of the process, okay, that electrical signal reaches the end of the tail, it releases chemicals, the chemicals travel across this gap and then are received by the dendrite on the next neuron, and that initiates the action potential again, okay. So that's the basic process. So if you think about our thoughts, our emotions, moving, memories, our senses, all of that happens, okay? All of our thinking, all of our awareness, all of that stuff, it happens via this electrical chemical process of our neurons, okay? Our many, many, many hundreds of millions of neurons that we have in our brain talking to one another. Okay, so this is a close-up at that synaptic gap. Oh, I'm sorry. Let me go back. I wanted to mention this is a live link. This will take you out to a YouTube video, and this is a further explanation of neurons. So when you download the lecture notes, this is a live link in the PDF. You can click on this. I've also included all of these additional links in Canvas. So underneath the link to the lecture, you'll see this first YouTube link. And this particular one is just, there's some more visuals, there's some additional information. In terms of what's going to be on the test, I'm just going to test you on the information that I'm reviewing in this lecture and the information that is in the NOBA module which is the reading assignment. But the videos that I include, I think can just enrich the content here. The person that made the video is just going to say things kind of again, and so you get that reinforcement of hearing it again. And it's a little bit more engaging to have a YouTube video on it. So please make sure to check that out. And that's the same thing here. So in my lectures, every time you see this green underlined text, that shows you that there's a link there. And when you download those lecture notes, or you can just go to Canvas, you can take a look at that additional content. All right. But so what this slide shows is a close-up of the terminal button. And this is basically where one neuron meets another. Okay. And so here, neurotransmitters, which are chemical signals, they cross the synaptic gap. Okay. So I explained this, but I'll do it again, is when the action potential, right, this electrical signal reaches the end of the axon, neurotransmitters are released and they float across the synaptic gap. They then bind to receptors on the postsynaptic spine, but we can just think of this as the dendrite of the next neuron. Okay? And that process, that releasing of neurotransmitter, which are then kind of caught or that bind to the receptors on the other neuron, is what really allows those neurons to communicate to one another. Now, there's several different types of neurotransmitters, and they're involved in different types of brain functions and bodily processes. So, for example, serotonin is a neurotransmitter that affects sleep, feeling hungry, as well as your mood. Dopamine is another neurotransmitter that's associated with attention, learning, and also the feeling of pleasure or reward. I'll come back and I'll review neurotransmitters again. The basic idea that I want you to extract, given that this is an introductory class, is that we have different types of chemicals. You've probably heard the term brain chemistry. Well, that's literally true, that we have different chemicals in our brain and they're responsible for different functions. All right, so let's move on and kind of zoom back out and talk about the brain. There's different ways to organize the brain, but the way that that the NOBA textbook or the NOBA module organizes it is to identify three main parts: the brainstem, the cerebellum, and the cerebral cortex, which is sometimes called the cerebrum, but I'll call it the cerebral cortex. I think that that's the more used term. I'll talk about each one of these in more detail. The brainstem we can think of as the most basic structure of the brain. It's located at the top of the spine and the bottom of the brain. It's the oldest part of the brain. It is sometimes referred to as your reptilian brain because we see a similar brain structure in less evolved animals like reptiles, like a crocodile. So that's kind of a nickname, is if people are behaving in a way that is kind of animalistic, we said that they're using their reptile brain or their crocodile brain. They're not using their more complex parts of their brain. The cerebellum in the back here is a structure that is involved with movement as well as posture, but it is associated with a variety of other thinking processes. But we can think of the cerebellum as particularly involved with movement and posture. And then finally, the cerebral cortex is this, we can think of the most evolved, the newest part of our brain in evolutionary terms, and it's also the most advanced part of our brain. It's in charge of all types of bodily and mental processes that we associate with awareness, with consciousness, such as speaking, such as planning to do something. The cerebral cortex also contains all of our primary senses, so sight, hearing, feeling, movement. Okay, that we can say that's located, or the activity of the neurons takes place in the cerebral cortex. Okay. So I want to, let's just a little bit more information about the brainstem. Okay, so again, this is the oldest part of our brain, this reptilian brain, and collectively, the brainstem refers to several different structures. There's the medulla, the pons, the midbrain, the thalamus, and the hypothalamus. So I'm not going to get too deep into the individual functions of each of these individual structures. If you go on and take more advanced psychology classes, you will, so that each one of these structures has its own function. But what I want you to know is kind of the collective function of all of these structures together. So the collective function of the brainstem. Okay. And so we can say that collectively these regions control things that are related to survival. So the brainstem controls our heart rate, our breathing, our digestion, our sleep-wake cycle. Some sensory and motor function controls our growth, okay, as well as other behaviors that are related to hormones. So again, these are really our most basic bodily functions. And when anybody gets in an accident or when there's severe damage to the brainstem, they'll need to go on life support because they're often unable to breathe on their own. So the term brain dead, if you've ever heard that, is used when a person's brainstem stops functioning and indicates that there's no chance of life support. So when somebody goes brain dead, they're often taken off of life support, and that's because the brainstem stops functioning. Okay. All right, so now let's move on to the cerebral cortex. So the cerebral cortex, you'll notice in this image, is actually divided into a left and a right hemisphere. Okay, and it's connected by a dense bundle of white matter that is known as the corpus callosum. That white matter is really a bunch of axons or tails. But the left and the right hemispheres of the brain are connected by this dense bundle of material called the corpus callosum. Okay, so both of these functions, or both of these hemispheres, are related to basically all of our different bodily functions. So both our left hemisphere as well as our right hemisphere control our motor, in other words, functions, in other words, our movement, and they also control sensory functions. Now you have maybe heard in high school classes or just on the internet or in the world that the different parts of your brain, like the left side and the right side, are responsible for different things. Like you might have heard things about people who are left-brained are more creative, people that are right-brained are more analytical. These claims are not really true. Okay, most brain functions do happen across both hemispheres. If anything, if there's any difference in the two hemispheres, there could be that our language, language is more dominantly found in the left hemisphere. So the left side of our brain, more than the right, is associated with language processing. All right. Now, what is the case with regard to our left side and our right side is we have this very interesting, we're set up in a very interesting way, which is that our brain processes information on the opposite side. And this is called contralateral processing. Okay, so what that means is that the left hemisphere is responsible for processing our motor information as well as our visual information on the right side of the body. So you'll see in this left-hand panel is that when we've got information that is in our right field of vision, it's actually processed on the left side of our brain. When there's information that is in our left field of vision, it's processed on the right side of our brain. Now, certainly there's information that is we can see with both eyes, but there's certain information like in our periphery that is that'll be processed on one side of our brain versus the other. Okay, it's also the case that our right brain, the right side, the right hemisphere, controls our left hand as well as bodily functions and movements on that left side. and the left side of our brain controls the right side of our body. So it is the case that we engage in this contralateral processing. But you'll see this link that I've included here that's led to quite a few myths about what our left side does and what our right side does. And in fact, even the website that I was able to find this very nice image repeats some of those myths, right? That it's the left side of your brain that is associated with creative thinking and the right side of the brain that's associated with thinking in an analytical way. It's not true. But those are myths, and those continue to be perpetuated in popular culture. And some of the reason why those myths exist and what they are, you can find in this YouTube video. So click on that link, or it's on campus as well. Now, one really interesting thing is that it is possible to live with having that corpus callosum split. Okay, so that bundle of material that connects the right and the left side. Some people that have had that you can have that surgically removed, and so people can have a genetic abnormality, have it severed. People that have epilepsy and suffer from severe seizures, they will electively have a brain surgery and have that corpus callosum severed. And you can survive with having your left and your right hemispheres disconnected. But studying split brain patients has really helped psychologists understand the function of the two hemispheres, including this idea of contralateral processing. Okay, that's helped us understand that the brain is laterally partitioned and that information that is received on one side of the body is sent or is processed to the opposite hemisphere. Oh yeah, sorry. So here's another link here. What you're going to see, I highly recommend that you check this one out. This is one of the, they're all interesting, but this was just fascinating to me. What you're going to see in this video is some work with a split brain patient. The patient's name is Joe, and he had epilepsy and a bunch of seizures, and so he elected to have his corpus callosum severed, and then he very generously started volunteering his time so that psychologists could study him. What you're going to see in the video is a psychologist running some tests on him, basically. So he's seated in front of a computer, and one of the tasks that he's being asked to do is read information on the screen. So sometimes a word or a picture is presented, it's flashed briefly in his right visual field. Okay, well, what do we know? Because of this contralateral processing, when information is presented in the right visual field, it's processed in his left hemisphere. Well, so again, it turns out that if there's any evidence for specialization of one hemisphere versus the other, language is dominant in that left hemisphere. So when a word or a picture is flashed on the right side, he generally has no problem reading the word or naming the object that is in the picture. However, something very funny happens when a word is flashed on the left side. Okay? Information on the left in the left visual field is processed on the right side, and language isn't dominant there. So the psychologist says, okay, what did you see? He says, I don't know. I didn't see anything. But then the psychologist says, well, close your eyes. I'm going to give you a pen. Just start drawing. And lo and behold, he's able to draw what he saw or what was presented in that left visual field, even though he couldn't name it. And even that had no awareness, had no idea that he even saw the picture. So it's really quite fascinating, and it illustrates both this contralateral partitioning of the brain, as well as the idea that our brain is capable of processing information that we're actually not consciously aware of. Okay, you'll see him on the video. It's very interesting. He said, the psychologist, I feel like it's spoiler alerts here, but it's like the psychologist said, well, why did you draw that? He says, I don't know why I drew that. So it's very interesting evidence that our brain can operate without our awareness. So this is some evidence that we have an unconscious mind. So check that out. Okay, another way to kind of segment and divide up the brain is by our lobes. And so our lobes make up portions of the cerebral cortex, and they're generally responsible for different functions. So in the frontal lobe, this is where things like speech, problem solving, planning, and organization take place. So when we're doing these things, when we're solving a problem or we're making plans for the day, the activity of our neurons, it's happening in that frontal lobe of our brain. The parietal lobe is associated with touch and taste. The temporal lobe on the side here, sound and smell. And then the occipital lobe is tracking of motion, recognition of face, basically vision. Vision happens, or visual information is processed in the occipital lobe. So this would be just to kind of start to give you some idea for questions that I could ask on an examination, is to be able to recognize the different lobes of the brain and the functions that are associated with those lobes. Okay. So another part of the cerebral cortex that is that I want to review is something called the primary motor cortex. So this is a part of the frontal lobe just to the side of something called the central sulcus. So this is really a strip that runs along the side of the brain, and it's on both hemispheres. Okay, and it's in charge of your voluntary movements. So if you wave goodbye, or you raise your eyebrows, or you whistle, right? You got to put your lips in a particular, to whistle or kiss somebody, you got to move your lips. It's your primary motor cortex that is responsible for that. So this is a really good example of how different parts of our brain are highly specialized for different things. Now, you'll see the close-up on the right-hand side. And so what you can see is that our different parts of our body have a unique portion of the primary motor cortex devoted to it. So you can see that each individual finger here, so in this yellow, you can look at our different digits, or different fingers. They have about as much space dedicated in our brain as our entire leg. Okay, so here, this would be the space for our leg. Your lips require just as much brain processing as the fingers and hand combined. So here's lips. So really, if you can think about that amount of space in your brain, there's just more nerve cells that are devoted to those body parts. So if you think about the complex motions that our fingers can make, right, like fine motor movements, as well as our lips and the complexity of the things that our lips can do with speech and language, it makes sense that there's just more neurons that are involved and dedicated to those functions. Okay, and just one more distinction that I want to make when it comes to the brain, and particularly the cerebral cortex, is that our brains contain both gray matter as well as white matter. And this is called because when you dissect a brain, they appear either grayish or whitish in the dissection, So the gray matter is composed of cell bodies. Okay, and the technical term is a soma for cell body. So your cell body really just contains the genes of the cell that are responsible for metabolism, which really means keeping the cell alive. The reason that you have that cell body is it keeps the rest of the cell alive. The white matter, on the other hand, I think I mentioned this, is composed of the tails or the axons. And so these axons are covered with the myelin sheath, and so that makes it appear white. Okay. So you might have heard the expression "use your gray matter" when you're supposed to think harder. The gray matter is probably just a reference to the cerebral hemispheres more generally, that the kind of the outside of your cerebral cortex is more gray in nature. But both the gray matter and the white matter are important to the way that you think, because indeed that white matter is the axon, and without the axon, neurons couldn't talk to one another or communicate. All right, so just a distinction, gray matter is the cell body and the white matter is the axons. All right, so that was the cerebral cortex. Now there's this other structure of the brain called the limbic system. And this is important to know because the limbic system and the structures involved with the limbic system are responsible for emotion, motivation, as well as the emotional associations that we have with our memories. So the limbic system primarily refers to the amygdala, which you see in red, the hippocampus, the thalamus, the hypothalamus, the basal ganglia, which you also see in red, and the cingulate gyrus. The thalamus and hypothalamus were defined as parts of the brainstem, but I just want to, the terms in red, I just want to review those, and the terms in red are the only terms that have the potential of appearing on the exam, okay? So I want you to be able to know those, and these are also defined in the NOPA text. So the amygdala, you'll see here, it's this almond-shaped set of neurons. It's responsible for processing and expressing arousal and emotion like anger and fear. So the amygdala is very well known when people are angry or when people are afraid, the amygdala is involved. And in terms of some of our most basic functions, you can think of the amygdala as being involved in something like the fight or flight response. Okay, I'll talk about that in just a little bit more because it has to do with our peripheral nervous system, but the amygdala is involved with those very basic emotions of anger and fear. The basal ganglia, okay, pointing here, refers to a group of neurons that lie very deep within the frontal lobes. It's involved with involuntary movement and coordination. And then finally, the cingulate gyrus lies just above the corpus callosum. Remember that the corpus callosum is what connects the left and the right hemispheres. It's responsible for coordinating sensory input with emotionally significant events in order to create memories. Okay, so the cingulate gyrus helps us remember things that are emotionally significant. So if we can think about our very kind of early evolutionary history, things that are important to us, it's good that we make memories about it, and so that we can learn and we can retain that learning. So if there's things that we were afraid of, like a predator, and we were afraid, we might remember that the last time I was here, there was this predator. This predator lives here. Maybe I'll avoid it. Or, hey, this food got me sick, and that made me feel very, very bad. I think I'm gonna, I know what that looks like now. I think I'm gonna avoid it. So the amygdala and the cingulate gyrus work together, but it's that cingulate gyrus that is responsible for creating memories and then regulating our behavior as a function of that memory. Okay, and so we still have, I talked kind of in evolutionary terms, but we still have that now. Okay, so um, if we're walking down a dark alley, we say, I don't know why, but I'm feeling very nervous right now. Maybe I'm just going to turn around. So cingulate gyrus. All right, that was the central nervous system. Let's now move to the peripheral nervous system. So in addition to the central nervous system, which again is the brain and the spinal cord, there's this complex network of nerves that we have, which travels to every part of our body. And this is the peripheral nervous system, okay? This complex network of nerves that goes to all the different parts of our body. Really, this carries the signals, the electrical signals through our body that allows us to do voluntary stuff as well as involuntary stuff. So some of the voluntary stuff is, let's just say we're going to type a text message. You have to make conscious choices about which letters to go where. Your brain needs to send the appropriate signals to your fingers to type the work, to type that text message. Okay, so we can think about that there's voluntary processes. Of course, we know that there's also involuntary processes. So without our awareness, our brain is always sending signals to our organs so that we digest our food, so that our muscles that are kind of holding us upright in our posture don't stop working. And so all of this occurs through the peripheral nervous system as well. All right. So the somatic nervous system is the part of our peripheral nervous system that assists us with our voluntary muscle movements. And so this, there's a set of both cranial nerves, that is nerves that come directly from the brain, as well as spinal nerves, which are nerves that originate in the spinal cord, basically. So the idea is that we're getting sensory information from our brain, from the cranial nerves. We're also getting sensory information from our fingertips, other parts of our body, our skin, because we're touching stuff. It's traveling through these nerves as a part of our somatic nervous system, and then we're making voluntary decisions. Okay. The other involuntary part of our peripheral nervous system is the autonomic nervous system. And so we've got two different parts of the autonomic nervous system, which is the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous system. Okay, so generally speaking, the autonomic nervous system is responsible for all the things that we do automatically. And that's a good way to remember the distinction between somatic and autonomic. Autonomic kind of sounds like automatic. And if you think about all the things that we do automatically without thinking, that's controlled by our autonomic nervous system. But we can divide the autonomic nervous system into the sympathetic as well as the parasympathetic nervous system. The sympathetic nervous system work together. The sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous system work together to arouse our body and then to calm it back down. So the sympathetic nervous system is often known as the fight or flight system. Is when our body gets kind of excited or speeded up, our breathing increases, our heart rate is increasing, our sympathetic nervous system is working. Okay, so that's involved in a fight or flight response where there's some stimulus out in the world, a predator, and we have to prepare our body for action. Alternatively, the parasympathetic nervous system is often kind of nicknamed the rest and digest system. So these are all the activities that are occurring when our body is normally at rest. So that we're able to, that we salivate to break down food, that we're able to go to the bathroom, we're able to urinate and defecate, that we're able to cry and make tears. These are all part of the parasympathetic nervous system. So you can think of these as kind of operating in a push-pull fashion, or kind of like a on and off, is that our body maintains a homeostasis, that we want to have these kind of balanced levels. But when we say are very, very nervous or afraid, you might kind of remember experiencing the sensation of having a dry mouth. That's because our sympathetic nervous system kicks into high gear and we kind of shut down the parasympathetic nervous system. So we're like, our body's like, okay, you have to do something that is potentially dangerous. We don't need to be devoting our resources to digesting food. So no more salivation. So these were survival, evolutionary adaptations to help us survive, but they continue even today, even for psychological phenomena. And so if you have to give a speech and you get nervous, you still have that same fight or flight response, and your sympathetic nervous system kicks in, your heart starts beating faster, you're breathing heavier, your armpits start sweating, all that stuff. That's your body mobilizing. And then after you give the speech, you sit back down in your chair or whatever it is, and then it's like, oh, okay, like my heart rate is returning to normal, and I don't have such a dry mouth. All right, so here's just a couple pictures. If you had to name the peripheral nervous system that was being involved, so we can think of the first picture in the pool. We can think about that as relaxing, and so this should show us that it's our parasympathetic nervous system that is involved. This picture towards the upper right, that's our sympathetic nervous system, fight or flight, same thing with the lower left. And then this one might be a little bit tricky, but this is our somatic nervous system. So not even our autonomic, but our somatic is we're making the voluntary decision to type an email or write a paper. I wanted to return to neurotransmitters, and this is just kind of where it fit into the lecture. I will say this: you do not need to know specifically any of these. So this is where you want to fast forward the lecture. You'd be my guest. If you find this stuff interesting, please continue to listen. But the idea here is that we have all these different neurotransmitters, and they're involved with different things. Okay, so acetylcholine is involved with maintaining cognitive function. Glutamate and gamma aminobutyric acid are basically our two neurotransmitters that work in both excitatory, in the case of glutamate, as well as inhibitory ways. And so they basically work together to control your brain's overall level of excitement or excitation, and that just means kind of the readiness of your neurons to fire an action potential. Our brain needs to stay in homeostasis, so there needs to be a balance of glutamate as well as GABA. If there's too much glutamate, that's associated with things like autism spectrum disorders as well as anxiety disorders. In contrast, high levels of GABA produce more relaxation or even being sedated. You could have these neurotransmitter levels that are affected by external things like the environment as well as what we put in our bodies, like alcohol. So alcohol kind of creates the sedentary effects of GABA. So there's more GABA that is released, and it inhibits glutamate. And so that's why we're relaxed when we have a beer or a wine. Norepinephrine is a primary neurotransmitter in the sympathetic nervous system, works on a variety of organs to control blood pressure, heart rate, and liver function. So again, when people refer to brain chemistry, they could be referring to any of these things. And so when there's different psychological disorders, it could be the case that people's neurotransmitters are just not operating quite right or at normal levels, and there could be too much of one or not enough of the other. One is excited, another is inhibited, and that can create an imbalance which can result in some sort of a dysfunction or a disability. Towards the end of the class, when we learn about psychological disorders, we'll kind of return to neurotransmitters because medications are often designed to control neurotransmitters either by increasing them or by inhibiting them. Okay. Two more neurotransmitters that you may have heard about already, high school or just living life, but two very important ones, so I'll say just a little bit more about them, are dopamine and serotonin. So when it comes to dopamine, this is the primary neurotransmitter that is involved with all kinds of stuff, but motor control, but also feeling reward and pleasure, as well as motivation. It turns out that if anybody has ever experimented with any kind of drugs, it turns out that the pleasurable feeling that you get while high results from stimulation in different parts of your brain that are associated with dopamine. And so the neurotransmitter that we can say unlocks these reward centers in your brain is dopamine. And it's associated with feeling pleasure and feeling reward. Now, dopamine is a really good thing. Okay? It's not just about getting high. It's when we are hungry and then we eat food, dopamine is released. And so that's a reward feeling. And so from evolutionary terms, this is like, okay, eating is good. We want to feel that pleasure after we eat, and that makes sure that we keep eating. Okay. Generally, feeling reward and pleasure is important for any bodily activities that are important for survival. And so even, you might think about, hey, I really, really had to go to the bathroom, and then I did, and that was a pleasurable experience. I felt a lot of relief. Dopamine is involved. Interestingly, drugs have the same effect, and so whether it's an opiate, alcohol, nicotine, cocaine, most drugs that you can imagine, we have a neurochemical reaction. It increases the amount of dopamine that is released to our reward centers in our brain. The problem is then we keep taking more drugs, and then that messes up our ability to release dopamine, and so we need more and more and more and more to release the proper amount of dopamine. Okay, we basically have our dopamine receptors will go away when we keep using drugs. Okay, serotonin is involved with quite a few things. It's involved with sleep, memory, appetite, mood, as well as others. It's also produced, it turns out, in the gastrointestinal tract in response to food. Now, a very interesting thing about serotonin is that there appears to be a relationship between kind of normal seasonal variations in levels of serotonin and the amount of available sunshine. So that's typically not a problem for us in San Diego where it's sunny all the time, but in places where it isn't, like the Pacific Northwest, and just in the wintertime when there is less daylight, we have something called seasonal affective disorder. So seeing less sunshine means that less serotonin is involved, and we tend to have more negative moods. All right, so went a little bit more into depth than I think I'm really going to test you on, but I think out of interest, just to be able to um, go into detail and let you know that we have all these different neurotransmitters, and they're involved with a variety of different brain and bodily functions. Okay, I'm going to end with how we study the brain. And so historically, before we had the technology that we do, the way that we understood the brain was to look at people who were rather unfortunate and who had accidents. And so this is still true today, but the earliest studies of the brain were really focusing on people that had an accident and had damage to some particular area of the brain. And then you could say, okay, what part of the brain appears to be damaged, and then what can this person no longer do, or how might they be different? One of the most famous cases in psychology of an unfortunate person who has been studied was an American railroad worker named Phineas Gage, who's pictured here on the right. Turns out he survived an accident in which a large iron rod, which he's holding, was driven through his head. You can see there on the left here too. So this rod got shot out. It goes through his head. He survived this miraculously, okay? And this was somewhere in the middle 1800s, like 1850s. Forget the exact time of the accident, but it was right around there. So that he survived this accident in that day was just incredible. But the people that knew him before the accident and then afterwards said that he was changed very much. That his left frontal lobe was destroyed. You can see here. And so people that knew him said that his personality changed. He became more angry, aggressive, irritable, and his behavior changed as well. So this was one of the first instances. We knew back then in the 1850s that the brain was involved in some way in adjusting personality. Okay. Now, I'll have to say, like, it could be that, or he could have just been grumpy because he had a pole go through his head. But this was taken as very early evidence that the brain is involved with personality. Now, fortunately, we've come a long way with our technology and our ability to study the brain, so we don't have to rely on unfortunate people that have had accidents. One technique, and the most widely used technique, is known as functional magnetic resonance imaging, or fMRI. Now, fMRI doesn't actually record the activity of neurons, but instead, these different color images that you see here reflect blood flow to the brain. And more precisely, the images that you see reflect the presence of blood that has more oxygen in it versus blood that has less oxygen. Active regions of the brain require blood that is richer in oxygen. And so in this way, by being able to take a brain scan and measure the oxygen levels in blood, scientists are able to guess that neurons in that part of the brain are active. Okay, it's kind of a guess, really, is to say, well, more oxygen-rich blood is going to that part of the brain, so it must be the case that those neurons are active. And so this allows scientists to be able to put people in an fMRI and then give them different stimuli or present them with different conditions. And so if it's looking at a photo or listening to music or being able to solve a problem or make a judgment, they can see what part of the brain is being used. So this is basically the state of the art in the science. It's not to say that it's not without its issues. And the big thing is the resolution. As you can think, just like the camera on your phone, your camera has a limited resolution. It only has so many pixels. And if you've got an iPhone, you've got a much better camera. It's a higher resolution versus, say, the one that I've got on my phone. So with an fMRI, the resolution isn't so good. Kind of the analogy is that if we wanted to be able to understand two neurons communicating to one another, that's a very, very, very high level of resolution. We're zooming all the way in. Current fMRI is kind of able to see the overall pattern of like 100,000 of those neurons at once. So it's kind of like trying to hear an individual conversation between two people in a massive football stadium that is filled with people. So it's good, but it's not that good. The other thing would be like the time span. Our brain is able to think very, very, very fast, like as in milliseconds. But blood flow happens more or less in seconds. So your brain is thinking 10 times faster than the blood that is going there. So basically the fMRI that you see is very delayed, and which is kind of also an issue of resolution. So the point that I want to make is it's good, but it's not nearly as good. We know our brain is much more specific and it thinks much faster than can really be captured by fMRI. Another technique that you should be familiar with, because it's probably the second most used technique, is called electroencephalography, or just EEG for short. So EEG measures the electrical activity of the brain. So this is different. So whereas an fMRI was blood, this is the electrical activity. Now, it isn't able to measure the electrical activity of like a single neuron or pairs of neurons. So the action potential that I talked about earlier at the module, an EEG can't pick up on that. What it can do is look at the total activity of all of your neurons in the form of neural oscillations, which are better known as brain waves. Okay. So it turns out that our brain waves have different frequencies, and those different frequencies, when we're able to make a recording, as you see here on the right, tell us, they correlate to different states of consciousness. So for instance, what you can do is you can bring somebody into a laboratory like this guy, and you can hook him up with this EEG. This EEG just has all these electrical sensors. It's like this big net. You put it over your head like a hairnet. That's able to pick up on the total amount of electrical activity. Doesn't mean that every single part of your brain or every single part of every neuron is working, but it's still able to give kind of a sum total of the electrical activity. That electrical activity produces a readout. And as one example, what we're able to see is that our brain activity, our brain waves, look very different from when we're awake to when we're in light sleep to when we're dreaming, as a for example. So you bring people into a laboratory setting and you have them do stuff. Look at a picture, listen to music, solve a problem, make a decision, and researchers are able to see what is the amount of overall brain activity in those situations. Okay, well that wraps it up for this lecture on the brain and the nervous system. I hope after listening to it, you know more than you did about what your brain is capable of, as well as how we study it. Thanks for listening.